At dawn, Warner stood on the creaking porch of his Warner's Vineyard estate in California, shoulders squared against the cool mist that curled around the old grapevines like a silent warning. He hesitated, wondering if he had misheard the rumble of the truck engine the night before, though deep down he knew exactly what was coming. For weeks, he had sensed the shift in his son Jake's tone, felt the abrupt chill in Clara's polite greetings, and observed the careful distances they placed between themselves and the portraits of Marion that still lined the hallway. Yet he could not have prepared himself for the moment when Clara's firm voice would tell him he had been downsized to the guest cottage, and Jake would stand by in that polished, detached way that marked him more a manager of the home than its heir. Simple as it sounded, the words cut deeper than any blade. Warner's life, 40 years of memories, harvests, and Marion's laughter, was being packed into cardboard boxes and shoved into cold storage without a backward glance. Slowly, he followed Clara's efficient footsteps down the hall, noting how she bypassed every photograph he had ever loved, as though those images were no more than outdated snapshots rather than the living echoes of their family's story. If it had been a dream, he might have woken himself. Yet, each sound of wood on wood, each rustle of packing paper, reminded him of the harsh reality. Warner paused in front of the doorway to the master bedroom, that room where he and Marion had lain side by side through long summers and difficult winters, where they had planned a future that no longer mattered to his son or daughter-in-law. He inhaled the air, tasting regret and rising anger together, and for a moment allowed himself the luxury of grief. Then, almost imperceptibly, his posture straightened. He remembered the deed tucked in his jacket pocket, the plain, unbreakable proof that the estate was his alone, free of encumbrance or claim. Despite Clara's carefully arranged modern art and Jake's new value-enhancing paint samples, the house belonged to Warner and to no one else. So while his heart pounded with indignation, his mind began to flicker with possibility. If this place was truly his, then selling it could be his own kind of harvest, one that might yield fruit in the form of justice. And yet, he admitted to himself with a quiet hesitation, it seemed almost too neat, too simple, an old man's gamble on a title deed and a hasty phone call to Mason Cole, the broker who had once asked him for advice. Still, the thought took root and grew in the fertile soil of his outrage. Today, Warner would not slink away into that cramped workshop cottage and fade into a background of kale chips and health warnings. Instead, he would watch them cram his life into boxes, and then, when the moment was right, he would return with a buyer who would claim the land under his own terms and leave Jake and Clara scrambling for shelter. By the time the movers trundled out with Marion's favorite vase, Warner had rehearsed every polite phrase he would need, every subtle critique he would allow himself, and every deliberate pause that might unsettle his family's confidence. In the lingering hush, as he stood alone amid the half-empty rooms and half-buried memories, he felt an unexpected buoyancy, an intellectual curiosity about how the next days would unfold, and a determined spark of rebellion that he had not felt since the first vines took root beneath his care. Warner woke before sunrise in the cramped guest cottage that Clara had deemed safer, and at first he simply lay there, drifting between memory and morning chill as the thin walls whispered with silence. Yet he could not ignore the dull ache in his shoulders, nor the distant laughter of the twins echoing down the hallway. So he rose quietly and padded to the small kitchenette to brew coffee on the single-burner stove, admitting to himself with a faint regret that Marion's old percolator would have given him richer flavor. Carefully, as though handling something fragile, he poured a mug and cradled its warmth, letting his mind wander back to the days when he and Marion had planted these very vines together, hands deep in soil, sharing whispered hopes about the fruit they would one day taste. Now, Clara's rigid care instructions lay scattered on the countertop. Heart-healthy herbal tea, low-sodium crackers, an outline of exercises suitable for someone of his age, all delivered with an unspoken critique that his body and his memories were equally outdated. Yet he found himself hesitating before discarding the pamphlets. Perhaps, he wondered, there was some truth in her warnings, some merit to pacing himself as the years pressed on. But as he sipped the bitter liquid, he also felt something stir. Two thoughts braided together with cautious curiosity that he could, and perhaps should, reclaim his life entirely. While Clara filed his prescriptions into a labeled box in the main house, Warner wandered through the gardens he no longer tended, pausing to stare at the crooked rose bushes he remembered pruning with Marion's help. Vivid as if drawn in watercolor, he recalled her laugh when he'd pricked his finger, the soft sigh they shared under the jasmine arbor. Subtle though it was, that memory pried open his resolve. The vines might wither without his touch, but this cottage held no such enchantment, only stale air and rigid rules. After breakfast, Clara's kale shake that left him cold and unmoved, he wrapped himself in a worn jacket and set out on a slow walk through the vineyard rows. The gravel crunched under his shoes, and each step seemed to awaken muscles he had forgotten he still had, whispering reluctant praise for the long hours he once spent under the Californian sun. At the far edge, where an old oak cast a generous shadow, he sat and dug in his jacket pocket for the title deed, unfolding the crisp paper with care as if it were a map to buried treasure. The legal description was plain but potent, carrying a promise of power he had never thought to use in anger. He allowed himself a measured smile, tinged with intellectual hesitation. Could one simple sale truly topple the elaborate edifice Clara and Jake had built around his life? He weighed the question like one of his finest grapes, considering texture, flavor, and finish, before deciding that it was worth the gamble. On his way back, he stopped by the garage, the place where Clara had stashed Marion's record collection, deeming it dusty relics and ordering them into cardboard boxes. He knelt and gingerly lifted a lid, revealing albums he and Marion had shared during quiet evenings. Miles Davis, Ella Fitzgerald, and old folk records whose grooves held stories older than he felt. With that familiar ache in his chest, he selected one, kind of blue, and slipped it under his jacket before shutting the box. The act was small, almost imperceptible, but it felt significant. He was gathering the pieces of his past in preparation for a future he alone would shape. Back in the cottage, he laid the record next to the pamphlets on the stained tablecloth, then fetched paper and pen to draft a letter to Mason Cole, the broker he remembered from his brief stint advising real estate newcomers. He wrote slowly, each sentence opening with deliberate variation. "Good morning, Mason. I find myself in need. It appears that my situation," hoping to convey politeness alongside an undercurrent of urgency. He paused twice to reword phrases that sounded too self-pitying or too confrontational, seeking a balance that would signal both his vulnerability and his quiet determination. By mid-afternoon, the letter was sealed in an envelope addressed to Mason's office in Santa Rosa, and Warner tucked it into the pocket of his jacket to mail on his next venture into town. As the sun slid toward the horizon, painting the sky in pale gold, he reflected on the day's small rebellions, tasting the grapevine's soil with memory, reclaiming a piece of music that still moved him, drafting words that might set events in motion. Each act, he realized, was a brick in the foundation of his plan, one that hinged on using the title deed he carried and the broker's goodwill, as well as a recording he had yet to make of Clara's own words condemning the house for profit. In his chest, a quiet flame flickered, no longer content to be the passive old man in the corner. Instead, Warner sensed that something profound was stirring, an awakening born of soil, song, and stubborn resolve that promised a reckoning he could barely glimpse, but already longed to see through. Warner did not sleep well that night, and when the first gray light of dawn crept through the thin curtains of the guest cottage, he found himself sitting at the small wooden table with a fresh pot of coffee brewing on the single-burner stove, wondering if this plan of his was too audacious or perhaps simply overdue. Nevertheless, he resolved to follow through, for in the cramped solitude he had rediscovered a clarity of purpose he had not felt since Marion's side-by-side hand in his. And though each sip of the bitter liquid seemed to warn him of his own age, it also steeled his nerves for the day ahead. After finishing his cup, he retrieved from the tiny bedside drawer a worn leather notebook in which he had carefully recorded every detail of Clara and Jake's takeover of the estate, from the new locks on the front door to the neatly labeled boxes in the garage. And with that notebook and the title deed folded into his jacket pocket, He set out on the half-mile walk to the country lane, where Mason Cole had arranged to meet him for coffee at the Vine and Barrel, a roadside cafe painted in faded white and blue, the kind of place Marion had loved in her thrift, and he hesitated as he approached the front door, feeling the weight of his own age and the enormity of what he was about to do, yet also a subtle thrill, like the moment a vine's bud bursts through to sunlight. Upon entering, he found Mason already seated at a wobbly wrought iron table under an old grapevine trellis, scanning a small notebook and looking every bit the broker Warner remembered: crisp shirt, keen eyes, steady posture. Mason smiled warmly, greeting him by name with a nod that conveyed genuine sympathy. "Warner," Mason began after they exchanged a firm handshake, "I read your letter. I'm sorry you're in this situation. If the title is clear and unencumbered, you have the right to list the property. No strings attached." Warner thanked him, his voice low, and took a moment to study the handful of men who trickled in to place their orders, reminding himself that this unremarkable cafe was the unlikely stage for the start of his subtle revenge. Slowly, Warner laid out his plan, allowing his sentences to vary in pace and tone. First, the legal facts. The deed has my name alone. No life estate, no trust, nothing to bind my hands. Then his deeper concerns. Clara seems to think I have no say, as though age renders one voiceless. And finally, the proposal. I need the listing to be discreet, coded under a generic address, and private showings scheduled when Jake is away. I would like to negotiate life tenancy in the guest cottage or secure construction of a new small home on the remaining acreage, with right of first refusal for me, or failing that, for my chosen beneficiary. Mason nodded thoughtfully, taking notes in neat script. After a sip of his espresso, he looked up with a hint of admiration in his gaze. "It's bold," he said, "but it's within your rights. I know investors who would bite at this vineyard, tech entrepreneurs fed up with Silicon Valley hustle, or perhaps a winemaker wanting a legacy property. I can prepare a confidential brochure by week's end and target qualified buyers." Warner felt relief blossom in his chest, but even as he thanked Mason, a quiet hesitation flickered. Would this shake his son's world enough? Then he remembered the final piece he had brought, an audio recording saved on a small thumb drive that lay hidden in his jacket pocket. A secret bombshell recorded when Clara, unaware of his attention while she sorted labels in the kitchen, had whispered to her sister that the house was nothing but a money pit, and that she couldn't wait to flip it for a fortune. He realized this evidence would give him leverage if Jake or Clara questioned the sale's morality or his capacity. With a gentle cough to clear his throat, he mentioned this to Mason. "I have a recording that might be useful if re-cleanliness or conflicts of interest arise during negotiation." And Mason's eyebrows rose in understanding, the broker's practiced grin turning wry. Mason slid forward a small leather folder containing draft brochures and sample marketing strategies. Images of sunlit rows of vines, elegant yet muted typeface, bullet points emphasizing untouched historic estate and development potential. Warner studied the page headings, noting how each description was careful not to name the vendors, and how the gallery of photographs included distant shots of the main house to obscure Clara's modern art installations. He tapped a finger against the glossy page, intrigued by the subtle dance of presentation and deception. When they had reviewed and revised the brochure together, adding a clause that a buyer must agree to preserve certain heritage features which would both protect Marion's legacy and deter lowball developers, Warner felt a surge of achievement, tempered by the quiet ache of loss. Mason then laid out the timeline. "I'll post the listing online Friday morning at 8 a.m. Showings will begin next Tuesday. If all goes smoothly, we could have an offer by the end of the month." Warner gave a slow nod, realizing that each day brought him closer to reclaiming his life, though at the cost of revolutionary upheaval. Sipping a final drop of bitter coffee, he allowed himself a rueful smile. It seemed almost too neat, the way the legal system could be used like a plow to turn over the vineyards of betrayal. By the time he left the cafe, the morning sun had climbed higher, warming his shoulders as he tucked the leather folder and Mason's business card into his jacket. Along the road, he encountered a young couple walking hand in hand under the vines, perhaps weekend visitors unaware of the drama unfolding. and for a fleeting moment, he envied their lightness before remembering that hope, like good wine, often fermented slowly before reaching its peak. Stepping back onto his property's gravel drive, Warner paused once more at the gate, listening to the wind whisper through the leaves, and thought, in 7 days, everything will change, and then they will see what it means to rouse an old man whose roots run as deep as any vine. For the next showing, Warner rose before dawn again, though this time his mind thrummed with cautious hope as he prepared for a meeting that felt far more personal than a simple sale. This time, the potential buyer was Thornton Barrington, a man whose reputation for integrity and respect for tradition preceded him. And though Warner hesitated at the thought of revealing too much of his plan, he also sensed that Barrington's genuine interest in the land might yield terms more favorable than a cold cash offer. As the morning rays spilled over the vines, he dressed in the same worn jacket and crisp shirt he had worn for Mason's meeting, locked the cottage door behind him, and walked the familiar path to the main house, keys jingling in his pocket like a promise. Upon arrival, he found Mason already greeting Barrington, who stood tall and relaxed in casual slacks, surveying the landscape with a quiet, appreciative gaze. His salt and pepper hair caught the sun, and his eyes crinkled at the corners, suggesting he had laughed often in his life and was not prone to harsh judgment. "Mr. Lamb, it's a pleasure to finally meet you," Barrington said with a firm handshake and a genuine smile that seemed to bridge the gap between seller and suitor. And for a moment, Warner thought he saw a reflection of his younger self in the man's thoughtful expression. As they walked through the grand foyer, past Marion's portraits that Clara had so carelessly ignored, Barrington asked questions not about paint colors or modern fixtures, but about the house's history. How old the oak beam in the living room was, what year the stone patio was laid, and who had planted the magnolia by the garden gate. Warner hesitated, then shared with measured reverence how he and Marion had purchased the land 30 years ago, how they had nursed the soil through drought and flood, and how the wine they produced had carried the essence of those golden hills in every bottle. Each sentence opened differently, some with factual precision, others with subdued affection, yet all spoke of a deep connection that transcended simple real estate. Subtle though it was, his critique of Clara's and Jake's recent changes slipped in when he mentioned the cottage's cramped quarters. "It served its purpose, but it lacks the character of the main estate," he observed, and Barrington nodded in agreement, as though this minor detail mattered as much as a favorable price. Outside, they strolled along the vine rows together, and Warner watched Barrington's face soften with each story of Marion's dedication, each memory of harvest celebrations beneath these same olive-colored leaves. He paused beneath the old oak where Warner had first spoken with Mason and gently touched the bark, then turned to Barrington and said, "This tree has seen our family through every season. I hope my future here, however small, will honor that spirit." Hearing that, Barrington's gaze grew thoughtful, and he replied, "I would be honored to preserve its legacy. In fact, I'd like to propose a life tenancy arrangement. You remain here in a new cottage built on the northern plot with full access to these grounds as long as you live, and I will restore the house's original character." Warner felt warmth bloom in his chest. Yet even as relief washed over him, he found himself pausing, subtly, wondering if Jake and Clara would contest such a generous clause. But he admitted to himself that having a buyer who valued history and humanity over profit was a gift he had not dared imagine. Over the next hour, they spoke with a lawyer Mason had arranged to join them by phone, reviewing draft terms that included a guest cottage design with 2 rooms and a panoramic window facing the bay, plus a stipulation that Warner's personal belongings be returned and cataloged, ensuring Marion's photographs and his treasured record collection would not disappear into storage. Each contract point was weighed with quiet respect, sometimes softly debated, sometimes affirmed with a thoughtful nod. And Warner found himself exercising a sense of authority he thought long gone, marking revisions in the lawyer's draft with careful, deliberate strokes. When Barrington asked to hear the recording that Warner mentioned, Clara's own words about flipping the estate for profit, Warner retrieved the thumb drive from his pocket, hesitated as he watched Barrington insert it into his car's Bluetooth system, and listened with a pang of regret as Clara's voice echoed through the speakers. "I can't wait to flip this money pit," she had whispered. Words meant never to escape the kitchen walls, now laid bare for all to hear. Barrington's eyes narrowed in surprise, and he paused the playback, then looked back at Warner. "This changes things," he said quietly, "but I admire your integrity in bringing it forward. It speaks volumes about who you are." The subtle critique in those words stung Warner. He had hoped for quiet discretion, but he also recognized that transparency with Barrington would cement the bond they were forging. By midday, they had settled on a purchase price that exceeded the initial offer by 15% and agreed on construction timelines for the new cottage that would begin within a month, with the grand renovation of the main house to follow. Mason drafted final amendments, and Barrington signed with a decisive flourish, handing the pen back to Warner with a gracious smile. "Welcome to your future home, Mr. Lamb. I look forward to seeing you there each morning." Warner thanked him, each word opening differently, yet each bearing sincere gratitude, and watched as Barrington clasped Mason's shoulder and walked away, leaving him alone in the sunlit courtyard. As the gentle hum of activity faded into silence, he felt an unexpected thrill, like the first sip of a long-fermented wine. He had navigated the intricate dance of betrayal, negotiation, and hidden evidence to emerge not only victorious, but with his dignity intact. Standing amid the echoes of Marion's laughter and the promise of new beginnings, Warner closed his eyes and allowed himself a moment of quiet triumph, knowing that the next chapters of his life would be written not by Clara or Jake, but by his own hands, steady, deliberate, and alive once more. That Saturday afternoon, Warner arrived at the main house for what Clara had hailed as a final family celebration, stepping onto the stone steps with unexpected steadiness despite the tremor of nerves in his chest. He paused at the threshold to breathe in the familiar scent of jasmine and lavender that once comforted him and now hinted at the betrayal he would expose. As he entered, he saw Jake fluttering about in a crisp white shirt, arranging hors d'oeuvres on a long oak table beneath a canopy of wisteria, while Clara stood by the patio doors, her shoulders squared, lips pressed into a thin line, pretending cordiality as guests mingled around the fountain's gentle trickle. A hush fell when Mason and Thornton arrived side by side. Mason with a confidential folder in hand, Thornton smiling warmly as though this were a simple house tour rather than the culmination of Warner's quiet rebellion. Slowly, Warner moved to the center of the courtyard, where a vintage microphone on a simple stand waited for him, and as he cleared his throat, Jake caught his eye and offered a brittle smile that seemed to acknowledge both welcome and wariness. "Thank you all for coming," Warner began, his voice firm but reflective, each sentence opening with varied cadence, some lines clipped and factual, others drawn out with the warmth of memory. "To mark what Jake and Clara call a closing chapter in our family's history here." He paused, allowing curiosity to ripple through the crowd. His daughter-in-law's parents murmured at each other, the twins looked up from their phones, and distant neighbors from down the lane leaned in, wine glasses in hand. "But," he continued, lifting one hand in that gentle gesture Marion used when she spoke of truth, "I've come to share that, in fact, this house is no longer mine, and soon it will no longer be yours." A collective gasp rose unnoticed above the soft string music as he signaled Mason to step forward. Mason opened his folder deliberately, revealing the signed purchase agreement that gleamed under the afternoon light, signatures of Warner, Thornton Barrington, and their lawyer, together with a registration stamp from the Sonoma County Recorder's Office dated the previous Friday. This document confirms that Thornton Barrington is the new owner. Mason announced with a practiced calm that contrasted sharply with the stunned faces around him. And for a moment, only the birdsong and the trickle of the fountain dared to break the stunned silence. Clara's face blanched, ashen against her rosé-hued dress. Jake's jaw slackened, and he clutched the crostini platter as though it might anchor him. Warner allowed a slow, intellectual hesitation to color his next words, a small pause pregnant with quiet critique, before adding, "And that," with a gentle lift of his brow toward Clara, "includes the guest cottage where I have lived these past weeks, as well as the promise of a new, custom-built home on the northern plot, designed to honor my years here and ensure my comfort." A murmur rustled through the guests. Some raised eyebrows, others tightened their lips, but none dared speak. Then Warner nodded to Thornton, who clicked the thumb drive into a portable speaker by the fountain and pressed play. Clara's voice, measured yet betrayed, filtered through the speakers. "I can't wait to flip this money pit for a fortune," she had whispered to her sister. The words trembled in the air like distant thunder, and Clara's hand flew to her mouth as her own confession echoed. Jake's eyes darted between his mother and his father, as though seeking a foothold in shifting ground. In that charged moment, Thornton raised his hand, first in apology to Clara, then in solidarity with Warner, and said softly, "Your words speak volumes about your regard for this home, Clara, and they underscore Mr. Lamb's rightful decision to entrust its future to someone who values its soul." He allowed his gaze to sweep across the assembled family and friends, a subtle critique in his tone that stung more than any accusation. At the far edge of the courtyard, the twins looked on with slack jaws, realizing for the first time that their grandfather was no helpless old man, but a force they had underestimated. Warner cleared his throat again, the finality of his next sentence deliberate and unhurried. "You have 30 days to vacate, after which you may retrieve your belongings. Respect will be shown to Marion's photographs, my record collection, and every relic of our shared history. And then I will live here on my own terms, in the place I built with her." As the last words fell, the sun dipped behind a wisp of cloud, casting a golden hush over the villa. Jake swallowed hard, Clara's eyes welled with mute tears, and only Martha, an old family friend, clapped slowly, her applause breaking the spell of disbelief. Guests began to murmur, stepping back to give the family space, but Warner did not flinch or falter. Instead, he looked out at the rolling vineyards, inhaled the warmth of the afternoon breeze, and felt a peace he had not known since Marion's last sunset. In that moment, he realized that the soil beneath his feet, once threatened by those who had sought to displace him, now anchored him more firmly than ever, and the applause that rose up then was not only for his victory, but for his reclamation of dignity. When the gathering dispersed, leaving Clara and Jake to nurse their shock amid the gathering shadows, Warner found himself alone by the old oak, Thornton's arm steady on his shoulder. "You did well," Thornton said quietly, and Warner nodded, a smile of weary triumph tugging at his lips. As the courtyard emptied and the lights dimmed, he stood tall beneath the vine-laced arbor, no longer a displaced elder, but a man who had quietly harvested his revenge, and, in doing so, had replanted his own future on the land he had always loved.